Okay, so this project is on a cross-district marriage migration in India, and this is joint work with Jacek Baszewski from the OECD and Prasanthi Ramakrishnan from SMU. And I have to say that the usual disclaimer about the OECD applies here. So this idea of project starts from observing two things. So the first one is that in India, within household inequality is an important share of all the inequalities. So for instance, Klassen and Lauti developed a multidimensional poverty index, and they estimated that 30% of total inequality in India were actually within households. And that's in general because the allocation of resources tends to be unfavorable for women. Then on the other hand, something that's important in households in India is actually about the way they are formed, and it's the fact that it's common for women to migrate for marriage. So first, something about the context. In India, the system is what is referred to as patrilocality of marriage, and that means when they get married, women move to the household of their new husband. And so to do so, a lot of women actually migrate in another place than the one where they are born. So of all women who migrated in their lives, 65% did so specifically in order to get married. And of these, about 1/5 migrated across districts. So when we say across district, we mean across districts within one state. And that's actually not trivial because in two different districts of the same states, you might speak a different language or different languages, and you might also have different cultures. So migrating from one district to the other one actually can be costly for these women. And the reason why this phenomenon of cross-district marriage migration is that important is the fact that sex ratios tend to be skewed towards men. So that means that there tend to be more men compared to men. And that is the case in general in the country, but that also varies a lot across regions. So in some regions, the sex ratios are pretty balanced, and in others, they tend to be quite skewed toward men. And so this drives these migration patterns. So the question that we ask is, how does marriage migration influence within household inequality? And we think that this could go two ways. So on the first hand, these women who migrate have to leave behind them support structure. They have to go far away from their family, and they also move to a place where they could face discrimination due to a different culture, and where they could also struggle to fit in at first because they don't speak the language. These things would affect negatively their bargaining power. So that would increase within household inequality. On the other hand, they tend to move from districts they tend to move to districts that have more skewed sex ratios. So they tend to move to districts where women are more scarce. And we think that this could also increase their bargaining power. So that would maybe affect positively within household inequality. So in the end, what we want to figure out is which of these effects actually dominates. So in this first, briefly, I will provide some empirical evidence for the correlation between across districts migration and sex ratio. And I will also investigate migrating women characteristics and the characteristics of the households they move into. And then we will move on to the collective household model, which allows us to estimate the bargaining power of women at the household level and investigate the relationship between marriage migration, women's bargaining power, and dowry. So we contribute to the literature in three ways. First, there's the literature on marriage migration in India, and what we do is study the relationship between this phenomenon and women's bargaining power. Then we also look into the effects of skewed sex ratios on marriage market outcome, and in particular on bargaining power of women. And then finally, we study relationships between marriage migration, dowry, and female bargaining power with this collective household model. So the data we use comes from mainly three sources. So first, there's the Census of India, and that allows us to measure at the district level the sex ratios. And we measure that as the number of men for 100 women. So when I'm going to say that the sex ratios are skewed toward men, what I mean is that the number is above 100, right? That I have more than 100 men for 100 women. The other data set is a national sample survey. So this data set contains detailed information on individuals' migration history. I observe a household, and for each member, I observe whether they are migrants or not. So in particular, for married women, I observe if they are migrants, which type of migration this is. So for instance, if this is across district, if this is across state, and I can also know the motive of this migration. So I can know if they are specifically marriage migrants. And then I also observe some characteristics of these women and of the household they marry into. So thanks to this, I can investigate, well, not only the share of migrating women by district, but also characteristics that are specific to these women. And then the last thing we do is that we use data from the Indian Human Development Survey. And this dataset contains information on several topics, including consumption. And this is going to be essential for us to estimate the collective household model. So first, I want to show some evidence of relationships between sex ratios and marriage migration. So on the first map that you can see on the left, what we represent is the sex ratios in terms of tercile. So as I said earlier, this is the number of men for 100 women. And here you can see that these sex ratios tend to be either more skewed toward women or more balanced or slightly skewed toward men. I also have to say that this number is an outlier. So mostly districts in this group have sex ratios that are pretty balanced. And as you can see on the map, this first tercile of sex ratio is mostly in the south and also in the east. Then the intermediate group is where the sex ratios are moderately skewed toward men. And you can find them when you move a bit more to the north and to the west. And finally, there are also districts where the sex ratios are the most skewed toward men, so where this is more difficult to find a bride, and these are more in the north and also in the west. As you can see, regionally this varies a lot, and you can really identify patterns here, and this is related to cultural factors and to preferences for sons. Then on the other hand, when we want to look at marriage migration, specifically across district marriage migration, we can turn to the second map to the right. And here what we represent is also terciles, but of share of migrants in the district. So with the previous data I introduced, the National Sample Survey, I told you that I could observe whether women were across districts marriage migrants or not. So at the district level, we can compute actually the share of women that are marriage migrants. So what we observe here is a district of arrival. And in red, we have the first tercile, so districts where there are the least marriage migrants. And you can see that these are more in the south and in the east, similarly to where we have more balanced sex ratios. And the more you go to the north and also to the west, and the more likely it is to be a marriage migrant. So what we want to show here is simply the fact that marriage migration is higher in districts that have more skewed sex ratios. Now, moving on to the specificity of these marriage migrant women, what we did with the National Sample Survey data is run a logistic regression. So the dependent variable is equal to 1 if the woman is an across district marriage migrant and 0 otherwise. And of course, we drop across state marriage migrants because they are a minority. So just to show you the results, among the explanatory variables, we have the log of sex ratios. Age, education, and some other variables. And we use two specifications, one without without state fixed effect, and one with state fixed effect. And what you can see is that the more skewed toward men the sex ratios are, and the more likely it is that the woman is a marriage migrant. So in districts with more skewness of sex ratios, there are more women that are marriage migrants, it's more likely to be one. This relationship is positive and significant. We also find that women with primary education or higher are more likely to be marriage migrants, and they are more likely to move into households where the head has at least primary education. They are less likely to move in households that belong to Schedule 5, which means groups that are discriminated against. And they also tend to move to households with higher consumption per capita. So we observe the specificity of women. Now, so far, it doesn't tell us exactly about their bargaining power. So we're going to move on to our model. So the model we estimate is a collective household model, and we followed the approach of listen sites. So what it allows us to do is identify a proxy for bargaining power at the household level. And then we're going to link it to marriage migration and test hypothesis about bargaining power, marriage migration, and dowry. So the general setup of the model here is the one of listen sites. Here you can see the household maximization problem. And so, as you can see, we have the utility of the wife here and the utility of the husband here. Then we have this mu, which is the bargaining power of the wife, and 1 minus mu is the bargaining power of the husband. Now, looking into the utility functions, you can see that for both spouses, we have first a sub-utility function and then a big C. This big C is public consumption, and that means the consumption of the household member that they share and that we cannot split. So for instance, that is rent, housing, energy, furniture, servants. So these things cannot be assigned to one household member. Both of them are using it, and this enter in the same, this enter both utility functions, and this is not split. So that's public consumption. Then the other part of the utility function of the spouses is the sub-utility functions that depend on little cf and little cm. And these are what the authors listen site calls private consumption. So this is just the consumption of the individuals, for instance, food or clothes. And then there's also, of course, the individual leisure. So you can see that there are two parts, one about individual variables and one about something that is shared. Now, the household maximizes its problem with respect to the different types of consumption and leisure. And the budget constraint is given here. So on the left-hand side, we have consumption. This I'm going to explain in a second. And on the right-hand side, what we have here is actually the potential income of the household. So we have WM bar, and this is how much the husband would earn if he chose to work full-time. And we also have WF bar, which is how much the wife would earn if she worked the maximum possible amount of time. And then we have YNL, and that's non-labor income. So that's an income of the household that doesn't come from labor. And so this is the potential income of the household. Now, of course, this is not the actual budget. So here we correct for this. HM and HF are the number of hours that each of the spouses actually chose to work. And WM and WF here are the wage, hourly wages. So here, this is how much the individual actually earn from working. And so now the budget constraint is correct. And the way why we think in terms of potential income is because this is going to be important for the measure of bargaining power and the estimation of the model. And so this bargaining power mu is actually a function of the household potential income, of the non-labor income, and also of other variables Z that are called distribution factors. And there are variables that impact this mu, but cannot directly impact preferences. Now, the next thing we do is that we're going to assume that these utility functions, UF and UM, are separable in, on the one hand, public consumption, and on the other, private consumption and leisure. So we assume that these functions are separable in public consumption and private consumption and leisure. So making that assumption allows us to follow Capori and define this problem in a two-stage representation. So the idea is that in the first stage, the household member jointly choose public consumption. So they agree together on how much they're going to spend on this public consumption. And to pay for it, they use their non-labor income, YNL. Now, it can be that YNL is larger or smaller than their public consumption. In that case, the remain YNL bar could be negative. So if they simply spend a C, big C that is larger than this, then YNL bar is negative. So YNL bar might be positive or negative, and then they have to share it. To share it, they will follow a sharing rule, and that defines that there's a transfer going to the wife, phi, and the remaining goes to the husband. So YNL bar minus phi goes to the husband. And this phi actually depends on the same variable as mu, the bargaining power. So the sharing rule, the rule that defines the transfer made to each of the spouse, depends on the same variable. So it depends on potential income of the husband, of the wife, non-labor income of the household, distribution factors. And so the thing is that what we will actually estimate is the sharing rule. We're not going to estimate new the bargaining power, we're going to estimate the sharing rule. And that's going to be our proxy for bargaining power. But the idea is that the more of the resources of the household you get, the more bargaining power you have. Now, in stage 2, we're going to deal with individual maximization problems. So the wife is going to choose how much private consumption she wants and how much she's going to work. And so leisure will depend on that. TF is the total endowment in time of the wife, and TF minus HF is the time that's left for leisure. So if she chooses HF, she also chooses LF. Now, in the same way, the husband also chooses how much to consume and how much to work. So you can see the elements highlighted in blue. Now, each of the individual deals with the second part of the problem. The way it looks is like this. So the individual problem of the wife is the maximization of a utility of a sub-utility function with respect to private consumption and leisure, subject to her individual budget constraints. And here you can see that we have the transfer that goes to the wife. And now on the other hand, there's the man's problem, which looks similar, except that here we have the amount that goes to the man. So YNL bar minus 5. In terms of specification, we will also follow listen side, and we will assume a CES sub-utility function. So here, alpha J stands for the consumption share. So we allow it to vary by gender. So we will estimate one for women and one for men. And we will also allow it to change with the education level. And then we also have the substitution parameter rho. Now, to estimate the model, we will also have to parameterize the sharing rule. And now I'm going to introduce var phi. So what I showed you earlier, this phi here, this is the transfer that is made in level. So this is actually the amount of rupees that go to the wife. And here, YNL bar minus phi is the amount of rupees that goes to the husband. Now, instead of reasoning in terms of transfer in a monetary amount, we can also think in terms of proportion, percentage, fraction of the resources of the household that go to the wife. And so that's what var phi is. Here, we are going to think in terms of a proportion. And we will parameterize it as a logit type function that depends on the same variables as phi. So WM bar, WF bar, YNL, and Z. And we can convert one to the other, but to estimate the model, we're going to deal with this function. And those are diseases that I didn't explain so much before. So again, these are variables that are called distribution factor, and they have to impact the sharing rule bar phi and how resources are shared, but they must not directly affect preferences. And this is what allows us to estimate the model. So using the individual maximization problems, the budget constraints, the specification that I introduced, we are able to define value functions associated with each labor supply choice. So for each individual, depending on their gender, we can define a value function for each of the choice they can make. And the choices are the time that they're going to work. So in blue, I highlighted the parameters we want to estimate. So they are the preference parameters, alpha F, alpha M, rho F, rho M, and also the parameters that enter var phi, the sharing rule. And the choice is in red, and the choice is how much to work and how much of leisure to take. So we define these value functions, and we assume that the error terms are type 1 extreme value. So when we do that, we can define the probability associated with each of the choices, and we can estimate the model by maximum likelihood. Some detail before I move on to the results. So for wages, what we do is that we compute hourly wages using hours worked, because in the dataset we have the annual labor income of individuals. And of course, we have individuals who are actually do not work. And for them, we will simply predict wages. So we use the Heckman selection equation, and we can predict their wage. The exclusion restriction is the number of children under 6. We also have information on non-labor income. So part of the non-labor incomes comes from farm activity, business, and there are also some other non-labor income. Then in terms of choices, we allow men to have 3 different possibilities. One possibility is to work full-time. So for all men who work more than 30 hours, we will assign 45 hours to work. We also allow them to work part-time. This is for men working less than 30 hours, and we also allow not working. For women, we allow work part-time or not work. And that's because in the data, this is actually closer to what we observed. So the average hours worked of working women was around 20 hours. So that's why we set it up that way. So basically these cutoffs were defined based on what we observed in the data distribution of the Indian Human Development Survey. Now, in terms of time management, as you can see by construction, women would have a lot more time than men outside of the labor market, and we did not want that to distort our parameter estimates. So what we did is that for all women, we removed 20 hours per week in their total time endowments. This is to account for home production. And for the sharing rule, when we parameterize it, we chose to put in it several variables. One variable is the log of household full potential income, and that is our WM bar, WF bar, and YNL that I introduced earlier, and we simply take the log of the sum. We also include the difference in education between the spouses, and then we put dummies for district tercile of sex ratios. So the idea is that in each state, we separate districts by tercile of sex ratio. We have the first, the second, and the third. And so the idea is that these are not, country level terciles. These are terciles within the state. So this tells us if within the state, the sex ratios tend to be more or less skewed than the average, basically. And that's important because what we study is across district marriage migration within the states. And as we saw earlier, women tend to move from districts where women are relatively more abundant to districts where women are relatively more scarce. So it's important to compare to the rest of the state. And finally, there's a variable for dowry size. So the variable we use here is a question from the IHDS where they ask women in their community what is in general the amount of money contributed to by the family of the bride at the time of marriage. And they give an upper and a lower bound. And what we do is that we average that. So the actual question is, in your community, how much family usually spend when their daughter gets married? And then since this varies a lot, and since the same number might not mean the same thing for different households, we divided that by the annual income of the households they marry into. So that tells us how big the contribution is compared to the living standard of the households they marry into. Now, just to give you an idea of some of our variables. So here you have the hourly wage of men, potential hourly wage because some men actually do not work. In that case, we use the Ekman equation to predict it. And here, this is for women. And as you can see, on average, men tend to earn more than 3 times what women earn. And then we also have the women's share of household potential income, which is about 14% on average. So this is even less than 1/3, which you could assume from that. But as you might remember, women cannot, in our data, women do not work full-time, whereas men can, which means that the maximum potential income of the woman is in the case where she works part-time, whereas for the man, it's in the case where he works full-time, meaning that we have in gen 14% here. We also find that on average, women tend to be a bit less educated than their husbands, that sex ratios tend to be skewed toward men. And here, this is the average dowry. And as you can see, when it's compared to the household annual income, on average, it's 4 times. So it's pretty large. And when we estimate the model, this is what we find. So for women, we have 2 possibilities, not working and working part-time. And you can see that in the model, we tend to overpredict a bit working part-time, but we're still quite close. And then in the case of men, we have the three possibilities. You can see that we are really close for men who choose to work, and we underpredict a little bit, not working for men. Now, in terms of parameter estimates, for the preference parameters, here we have the elasticity of substitution of the wife and of the husband. And these numbers mean that consumption and leisure complements, which we think makes sense. Then we have the consumption share of the wife, which is the alpha we had earlier in the model. And this can change by education level. So for women with low or high education level, we estimated in the end that these were quite close. Whereas for men, we find that men with higher education tend to give more weight to consumption. Now, here, this is how the sharing goal that we estimate is distributed. So this is our phi. And as you can see, it tends to be, in general, a bit under 50%. This number means that women would get less than 50% of the household resources. Now, what I have to specify, and that's important, is that following this insight, our sharing goal is identified only up to a constant. So that means that we have to make some assumptions to be able to pin it down. These assumptions are, for instance, if the household has the average level of potential income, then there's equality. So we make these assumptions. Mostly we follow the specification of listen type, and then we adapt it to the variables we had. And that allows us to pin it down. But so more importantly than the actual level, what's really important is to see how the variable impacts the sharing goal. So how, when the variables that enter the sharing goal vary, how that affects the sharing goal, not the actual level. And that's what we're going to look into in a minute. But here, this is just for you to see more how it's distributed. So the parameters in the sharing goal, the estimates are here. First, we have the log of household potential income, and we find a negative association with the sharing goal. So this means that households with higher income tend to be those where women have less bargaining power. Then we find a small and positive coefficient for difference in education. So these coefficients mean that when the wife is relatively more educated compared to the husband, she seems to have a bit more bargaining power, but it is quite small. Then for the sex ratios, so the first tercile here is when within the states, the sex ratios tend to be less skewed toward men. And here, the third tercile, this is when in the states, the districts tend to have the most skewed sex ratios. So where women tend to be the most scarce. And what you can see is that in both cases, we have negative coefficients compared to the intermediate category. So that means that compared to the intermediate category, it looks like being in the first or third tercile is associated with less bargaining power. And if you remember at the beginning, when I introduced the potential mechanism, we were talking about the scarcity of women. Well, it looks like, being relatively more abundant is associated with less bargaining power. But on the other hand, these districts where women are more scarce, which is generally districts that might be less favorable for women, are also associated with less bargaining power. And then finally, we also have the log of dowry size compared to the household annual income, and we find a negative association. So we find that when the contribution of the bride family tends to be larger, this is associated with less bargaining power of the wife. Now, to see how this looks in terms of distribution of the sharing goal, so first, for the log of income, we separated households into quartiles of income. And the first quartile, this is where the households have the higher income. And you can see that the distribution of the sharing goal seems to be more to the left of the plot. So it looks like the higher the income of the household and the less bargaining power women tend to have. And that might be a bit counterintuitive, but our interpretation for that is that actually households with higher income tend to be more conservative. And so we think that might be why we observe this pattern. Now, that's in terms of proportion of the resources, but if we look at what it means in terms of absolute level, in terms of amount of rupees, this looks like the following. So here, instead of R5, this is phi. This is a transfer that goes to the wife. And we still have in purple households that have the highest income. And as you can see, they tend to give a transfer that is much larger to women. So these women are still better off in terms of level. It's just that the proportion compared to the overall household income tends to be smaller. Now the distribution of the woman's share by education relative to the husband. So it looks like when women are at least as educated, the woman's share is marginally higher. Then we have the distribution of the sharing role by type of sex ratio. So we have the terciles I just talked about. The first and third tercile are to the left here. And we can see distinctly that when women are in the districts in the intermediate category, those where the sex ratios are moderately skewed toward men. This is where they seem to have the most bargaining power. And finally, for the parameter estimates, we have dowry size. And we see also here clearly that when dowries are relatively smaller compared to the household living standards, women tend to have more bargaining power. And we think that makes sense because in more progressive households, dowry is something less important. So it's likely that women here who paid smaller dowries moved into households that are more progressive. And so that's our parameter estimates. Now, we wanted to show you the choices, how the sharing goal looks by choice. So for women, for instance, who choose to work part-time rather than not work, you can see here the distribution of the sharing goal. And you can see that women who choose to work seem to have more bargaining power. This also, I think, makes sense intuitively. And then let's look at migration. So you might have noticed that in the model, we did not so far explicitly put migration. So the reason is that in the Indian Human Survey, we do not explicitly see if the individual is an across-district marriage migrant. We observe several variables that are indicative of whether the person is a long-distance migrant, but not specifically across-district marriage migration. So one thing we observe is the district they are in. And so we can know if they are in a district that has high or low marriage migration using the data we had before with the National Sample Survey. And so here, for instance, when we plot the sharing role and we separate districts in terms of probability of marriage migration, we find that there doesn't seem to be a very large effect. So being in a district with more or less migration doesn't seem to very much impact the sharing role. And now what we are mostly interested in is not the impact of being in a district with high or low migration, is actually the impact of your own status. So for the wife, whether she is a marriage migrant or not. To do that, we're going to do several things actually. So first of all, as I said, we do not explicitly observe across district marriage migration, but it is in any case very collinear with the district sex ratios. We do not want to put it explicitly as one of the variables of the sharing goal, because the model, if we do that, is not well behaved, because it's just too collinear. So we're going to do something different. So the first thing we do is do some registform analysis. So with the data of the Indian Human Development Survey, which is the data to estimate bargaining power, we are able to predict the migration status of women. The way we do that is that I showed you earlier a logic regression for being a marriage migrant or not that was estimated with the NSS. And using the parameter estimate of that regression, we can predict in this other data set the probability that the individual is a marriage migrant or not. And we can do that because we observe the same variables in the HDS. So we can predict here the probability of the wife to be a migrant. So what we do first is that we regress the sharing rule, the proxy of bargaining power, on the probability of the wife to be an across-district marriage migrant, and we find a negative association between both. So we find that the more likely a woman is to be a marriage migrant, and the smaller her bargaining power seems to be. And this is robust to adding state and district fixed effects. And for robustness, we also used a variable that is in the HDS, which is a distance from natal family in house. And we find also a negative relationship. So we find that the further from a family a woman lives, and the smaller her bargaining power seems to be. So now we're also working on a way to integrate this marriage migration into our model. As I said earlier, we cannot put it as one of the variables in the sharing goal because this is too correlated with the sex ratios. But what we can do is estimate separately the sharing goal by migration status. So we can estimate parameters of the sharing goal for migrants, and on the other hand, parameters for non-migrants. And to do that, we do two things. The first thing is that we're going to predict the migration status using the parameter estimate I told you about. And the idea is that in our sample, with all the individuals, for each woman, we are going to predict whether she is a migrant or not, using her individual predicted probability. And using it with the Bernoulli draw, we are going to predict if she's a migrant or not. Then we do that for all the individuals, and we estimate the model. And we estimate the parameters of the sharing goal by migration status. And we don't do that only once. We do these draws and estimate the model once, and then we keep doing it. We do that, we're planning to do that 100 times. For now, we did it only 5 times. Once it's done, we want to average the coefficients estimates and also bootstrap the standard errors. For robustness, what we also do is separate individuals into categories using a variable that is in the IHDS. And this variable is a question asked to women about whether it's possible for them in the same day to go visit a member of their family and come back home. And with this variable, we have the idea of whether the woman is likely or not to be a long-distance migrant. And we use that for robustness. And for now, the results that we have are very much in line with what we have with the predicted probabilities.
Sorry, Sophie, you have, sorry, so I'm very sorry. You have 5 minutes now. Yes.
Great. That's, yeah, perfect. Thanks. And the other thing we do is also that we add one variable in the sharing goal, and this is a variable on the wife family status. So that's a question about whether the economic status of her native family was better, worse, or equivalent to the one of the husband at the time of the marriage. Okay, and when we do that, we find first that the parameter estimates for migrant, non-migrants have the same effect. So basically, if a variable has a positive effect for migrants, it will also have a positive effect for non-migrants, but what changes in the magnitude. So depending on the status, the effects are not going to be as large. And we did a decomposition of these effects because we wanted to know if this difference was due to the fact that migrant women have different characteristics. So if this is simply a difference in endowment that drives this difference, or if this is actually a difference in treatment. If it is their status, that means that they might be treated differently, and mean that the sharing goal is going to be different. So we did a decomposition to see whether the effects come from endowment or estimates. And for now, our results suggest that this comes mostly from the estimates, so from how they are treated and therefore how they are endowed. And we tend to find a smaller sharing goal for migrants. And so to conclude, what we do in this project is that we measure spouses' bargaining power at the household level, and we show that marriage migration is associated with lower bargaining power for women. And finally, we investigate the relationships between marriage migration, dowry, and women's bargaining power.
Thanks a lot, Sophie, for this wonderful presentation. Now I will give the floor to Ariane, which will be the discussant in this session. So Ariane, you have 10 minutes and the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much. Let me just share the screen. Okay, you can see the slides?
Yes, all good.
Yeah, okay, sorry, I didn't see anything. Okay, so yeah, thank you, Sophie, for this very nice presentation. And yeah, I just also wanted to say that I really enjoyed reading the paper. I think it was very well written, and I think it's very interesting to see now that already there's some progress that I was going to comment on, but I see that you already have some more stuff that you worked on. So, okay, so I'm going to be very brief on the contributions. I think it's very clear in the paper and also in your presentation which literature you're adding to. So maybe I can just highlight a couple of things that for me were most important. So first of all, I think we can acknowledge that you're adding to a very qualitative heavy field or literature with the marriage migration. So you're offering quantitative evidence with large-scale data from India with different data sources, and you combine the reduced form analysis with a structural model. So I think that already adds a lot to a comprehensive understanding of what's going on. And also related to this, to the fact that maybe the previous literature has focused more on smaller or on more specific contexts where also the distances are more of outliers, maybe in terms of north-south or across the country migration or even across borders, and you're looking at the cross-district migration within a state. So I think that's an important addition, because you basically show that even comparatively short distances, both physical and cultural, matter for the marriage or for the migrant wives. So yeah, I think that's very very important. Okay, so let me come to my first main comment, which so I have two comments, but I think the second comment you addressed a lot, so I'm going to spend a little bit more time on this first comment and suggestion. This is basically on the exploration of the channels, which from when I was reading the paper, I was building the kind of story that I think you are introducing here. So I was trying to make sense of the findings with this more theoretical basis. So basically, just to recap, I think the two main findings that speak to this kind of story is that first you find that marriage migrants go to places with a higher sex ratio, which might imply higher bargaining power. And then in the second part, you show that actually marriage migration is negatively correlated with bargaining power. So in that kind of theoretical framework that you were also showing in the introduction, that kind of leads you to the conclusion that it's not the sex ratio channel, but rather the lack of family support. And then you also go on to, I mean, in the paper, there was a section on the role of dowry, which you then kind of introduced. So there I was a little bit puzzled what the role of dowry actually is in this framework. So I think you can maybe in the introduction be a little bit more specific about if where is the relevance of the dowry in that specific context. And more importantly, I think for me, when I was reading, I would have liked to see a little bit more of the exploration of these channels, and if these are actually the relevant channels or if there are alternative explanations. In particular, the positive correlation of sex ratio and bargaining power. I was wondering if it could also be the other way around, that if a higher sex ratio implies a worse gender norms, that this would also be in line with with your findings. And so maybe you can show some correlations between the sex ratio and female labor force participation, or other empowerment measures. And then I was also wondering about this this finding you have of the U-shaped correlation between the sex ratio and bargaining power, where you find that the more skewed and the less skewed districts relative to the middle are related to a lower bargaining power. So I was wondering if that also goes into that explanation, or how that relates to the explanation of the correlation between sex ratio and bargaining power being positive. And then something you also, I think, addressed a little bit, especially at the end, is the selection into marriage migration. And what I was thinking about is if still, even in those places, if there is really, if women have a higher bargaining power, but it is actually just absorbed kind of by the local women, because local women somehow are preferred, whereas migrant women have some traits that are less preferred. And so, yeah, maybe there's a difference between the type of women in that same place. And also, yeah, I was wondering, again, the selection of migrant women, which you were now talking a little bit more about. Why do they move away from the district? Maybe you have some information about the district where they come from, so you can make a little bit more sense of who these women are. And then another, maybe more of a curiosity thing, but it might also be relevant in this context, is how do these migrant wives find their husband, or how these migrant couples are sort of arranged, and if that is different from how local couples form. And then, yeah, and then in terms of the conclusion of that, then it must be the family, or it's probably the family support that is lacking. So I was wondering if you can show some descriptive evidence of the networks of the migrant wives, or their ties to their families. I think that would be really interesting in speaking to that explanation. And also coming back to this, the distance of the districts. Yeah, I was wondering, you say that this might also be a potential reason that there's cultural discrimination, which is even the case in cross-district moves. But yeah, I would also like to see some evidence if there's any data on this, just for a reader that is not so familiar with the context. I think that would be very interesting. So now my second comment was more on the model choice, so the choice of the model, and then the choices within the model. And so I think that one big question mark was, if I come to the second point directly, was why you're not including marriage migration in the function of the sharing rule. And I think the two explanations that I thought about, I think that's what you basically said. So I guess it's just about mentioning that in the paper as well, maybe also at the beginning, because I think that's a big point, that that you start to wonder if marriage migration is the focus of the paper, then why is it not in the model? But I think those are valid points, and you have ways to circumvent them. Yeah, and the second point, I think, is also partly being addressed with your new developments. Because I was just wondering, I mean, I'm not doubting that this is the relevant model to use, but I was just wondering if you can give more the advantages of this model compared to other models, to have a bit better understanding of why you chose this model in the first place. But yeah, that's it from my side, and thank you again for the nice presentation and for the paper.
Thank you very much.
Yes. So now, Sophie, if you want to reply to the comments of Ariane, or comment them, this is the time.
Thank you. For that, so let me answer to your first comment. So I think one of the first things you said was about why dowry is important. So yeah, the reason why we are not very explicit yet in the paper about what we do with it is that dowry is important in India. In most cases, dowries are paid, but we did not finish developing our results for the relationship between dowry, marriage migration, and also we want to be really sure of the story. So the thing is that in the literature, something that has been found is that women who migrate for marriage tend to pay less dowry or no dowry. So what we wanted to check if and I think we do mention that in the manuscript, is if this marriage migration can be used by parents as a way of not paying the dowry. But for now, we don't have yet fully our results, so we cannot say that more explicitly. So that's why. But in the long run, this is going to be pretty important. Then, more generally, your first comment was, would you mind sharing your slide again, please?
Yeah, sure. 1 second.
Thanks.
So here.
Yes. So about the channel, yeah. So I mean, one thing about the U-shape is that we think for districts where women are relatively more abundant, this is a sort of scarcity story. So being more abundant is not a good thing for bargaining power. And on the other hand, being in a district where women are very scarce, we believe it's not so much about how many women there are, but about gender norms. And I think in the data we have in IHDS, there are some questions on gender roles and gender relations that are asked at the household level. So something, and we know in which districts people are. So something we could do is see whether, we find a relationship between what people tend to answer, the district they are from, and the district of more or less skewed sex ratios. That's a possibility. That's something we could do. So far, we haven't done it, so I can't tell you exactly what we would observe. And our local women preferred. So yeah, so that's why in the end we think the best way to deal with it is to estimate to a different chain goals. Because at some point we thought, well, maybe actually one variable has a positive impact for someone with a specific status and a negative impact for someone else. And so far what we find is not this. So we do not find that the same variable will have different impacts, but we find different magnitudes. How do immigrants wise find their husbands? So that we do not know. We know how the decision was in the data set. Women are asked if they chose alone with their family or if it's only their family, but we do not know exactly how the match was made. And yeah, and for your second comment, I think that's what we are doing now is going to solve part of it, right?
Yeah.
Thank you very much for the discussion.
Okay, thank you.
Should I answer other questions in the chat now?
Yes. Sorry, I lost the connection for like 10 seconds. Yes. Okay. Amazing. So now, if there is any question from the panelists, if not, we also have one question from the Q&A. So if anyone has a question, yes. If not, I'm gonna mute Professor Goli so he can ask his question now. Second. Okay. So Professor Goli, now you can speak. Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you so much. Can you hear me now? Right.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Sophie. And this is something very interesting to me, this topic, because I've been working on child sex ratios for the last 10 years in India, and I have written quite a bit on the patrilocality, patriarchy, land and patriarchy hypothesis. Okay. So my question is basically something which is theoretically driven. Basically, the marriage migration in India is basically as a part of a patriarchal culture. It's part of patriarchal system. Okay, it's not something which is driven by certain change in certain socioeconomic factors or etc. It's basically it has been thousands of years, like since maybe the civilization, since maybe the origin of patriarchy. Since then, this mostly since the settled like when the family, or since the origin of family, I can say that family system. So the basically my previous research says that it's a patriarchal culture that actually undermines the utility of a female child in Indian families. Basically, the Indian families thinks that, okay, the daughter someday has to migrate after marriage, and she has to somehow go to some other households. So therefore, they think the daughter has a much more burden, because they have to pay dowry, they have to pay for marriage expenditures, they have to pay for the education, they pay to healthcare. So this will like rearing a daughter is like a much more economically burdenful, and also she's not available for them as for social security for in the older ages. So she's not going to be there with the family in the older ages as she migrates to some other household. So therefore, that actually this kind of thinking that leads to basically elimination of the girl child through the sex selective abortions in India. So that basically the patriarchal culture that is marriage migration, that is the root cause of son preference, and that son preference leads to sex selective abortions, and sex selective abortions leads to child sex ratios, male skewed child sex ratios. And if you look at the Indian sex ratio by age group wise, in the upper ages we don't have any skewness. Okay, it's even rather we have since 90s we have better sex ratios in the upper ages, okay, for the females. But now we have still a predominant male skewed child sex ratio and continued male skewed child sex ratio at the lower ages, especially at birth. Now we have excess female child mortality has disappeared. Now we have basically high male skewed child sex ratio at birth. So my hunch is that, you can look at my paper, also read that I have given a lot of theoretical things as well. So it's basically the causation is other way around. It's like child sex ratio, the patriarchality, which I define based on marriage migration, and some people have also defined this based on the co-residence of parents and children as well. But we have seen like the locality means basically women is migrating out after the marriage, is not going to stay with the parents. So that has a relationship with the causation is from the patriarchality to child sex ratios. And even the bargaining power that you are talking about, basically, you see, these all, but the indicator that you are taking in the bargaining power, basically we select as a determinants of child sex ratios in India. Okay, so there also it's causation is other way around. So what I suggest is basically, can you do some IVs, okay, IV regressions, or to see them, test the reverse causal, eliminate the endogeneity, and look at that, whether even after eliminating endogenous gas simultaneity, then you still find a relationship between the child sex ratio as driving as a marriage migration. And the marriage migration in India is mostly interdistrict, right? And the recent phenomena of interstate marriage migration is only happening in 2 states where there is high skewed child sex ratio for a very decades, like Haryana and Punjab, where for the decades there is a high skewed male skewed child sex ratio, where now currently we have a huge problem of marriage queues, where the male, female, there is a deficit of females in the marriageable ages. So there you can see that the female is migrating as a result of high male skewed child sex ratio, but that proportion is too less. It's a very less compared to the other way around. So this is what my suggestion, but analytically, you can test whether there is any reverse causality or not. You need to just perform a different statistical econometric approach to see this.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, this is something I think we could also look into. But then the patrilocality of marriage you're talking about, that would be for all households where there is marriage, right? So we were looking, within the context of marriage, about specifically, whether you go far from your family or not, or that would change bargaining power. I think what you're saying is to test the opposite, right? To test how bargaining power impacts sex ratios.
Yeah, it's a reverse. There also you have a reverse causality. It's a two relationship that you're proposing, that marriage, the child sex ratios leads to marriage migration, skewed child sex ratio leads to marriage migration. The other relationship that you're proposing is the skewed child sex ratios have a U-shaped relationship with bargaining power. In the both cases, I have an hunch that there is a reverse causality, which we have tested in the paper that I have given here in the link, and the other also we have tested in many other papers. Wherever I have taken child sex ratios as a outcome variable, we used all this bargaining power variable as a predictors of child sex ratios.
Yeah, thank you. I think we can look into that. Thank you.